This happened a few years ago after I took a solo trip out of state. I'd spent a few days camping and hiking, and I was driving home alone in the early evening. It wasn't fully dark yet, but the sun was already starting to drop. The sky had that dull orange color it gets right before night sets in. I still had a long drive ahead of me, but I wasn't in any rush. The road was familiar, and the traffic was light. About halfway into the drive, I pulled off the highway to stop at a gas station. It was just off the exit, one of those places that also had a small convenience store attached. Nothing about it stood out. It was clean, well lit, and there were a few other cars there. I filled up my tank, then went inside. I grabbed a drink, a couple of snacks, and paid at the counter. The cashier made small talk. Everything felt normal. When I walked back outside, I didn't notice anyone watching me. No one was standing too close. No one followed me to my car. If anything, the place felt quiet. I got into my car, started it, and pulled out of the station like I'd done hundreds of times before. A few minutes after merging back onto the highway, I noticed a black SUV behind me. At first, it didn't register as anything unusual. Highways are full of cars that come and go. It wasn't tailgating me, and it wasn't driving aggressively. It just stayed there, a few car lengths back. I drove for another mile or so and forgot about it. Then I changed lanes. The SUV changed lanes too. I told myself it was probably a coincidence. Maybe they were heading the same way. That happens all the time. A few minutes later, I slowed down slightly, letting my speed drop by a few miles per hour. The SUV slowed down with me. That's when I really started paying attention. I sped up just a bit, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. The distance between us stayed exactly the same. No matter what I did, it stayed behind me. The road ahead was getting darker, and the traffic was thinning out. There were long stretches where it felt like I was the only car on the highway, except for the SUV behind me. Every time I checked my mirrors, it was still there. It didn't try to pass. It didn't fall back. It didn't move into another lane. It just stayed. My drive home was still about 45 minutes away. I started thinking about what would happen if I kept going. I'd eventually be driving through a much darker stretch of road, far from exits, far from help. I didn't want to find out what this driver was planning. I picked up my phone and called 911. I remember trying to sound calm as I explained what was happening. I told the operator where I was, what direction I was heading, and that I believed a vehicle was following me. She told me to keep driving normally and to stay on the line. A few minutes later, I saw flashing lights ahead. A police cruiser pulled onto the shoulder, and the operator instructed me to pull over behind it. The moment I slowed down and moved to the shoulder, the SUV behind me did something that confirmed everything I'd been feeling. It didn't slow down. As I came to a stop, the black SUV suddenly sped up, blasting past both my car and the police cruiser at a high speed. The officer barely had time to react. I stepped out of my car as the officer ran back to his vehicle and took off after the SUV with his lights and sirens on. Another cruiser arrived a few minutes later. I sat on the guardrail while I gave my statement, replaying the entire drive in my head. About 20 minutes passed before the officers returned. They told me they'd caught the SUV. The people inside were part of a carjacking group that had been operating along that highway. They specifically targeted drivers who were alone, especially people stopping at gas stations and rest stops during the evening. One of the officers explained something that stayed with me ever since. They don't usually take the car at the station. That's too public, too many cameras, too many witnesses. Instead, they watch, they wait, they follow. They wait until the driver is far from help, when the road is dark and empty, and there's nowhere to run. If I hadn't called when I did, they would have stayed behind me until I reached a stretch of road where no one would hear me. I made it home safely that night. But ever since then, whenever I leave a gas station, especially at night, I check my mirrors. This happened a few years ago while I was driving home after visiting family. I'd stayed later than I planned, and by the time I got on the highway, it was already after 10 p.m. The road I took was familiar, but it was one of those long stretches of highway that felt isolated at night. No towns, no streetlights, just trees and open land on both sides. Traffic was light. I could go several minutes without seeing another car. About 15 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights appear in my rearview mirror. That alone wasn't unusual. Cars come and go on highways all the time. I kept driving, barely thinking about it. Then the headlights flashed. Just once. At first, I assumed it was a courtesy signal. Maybe my taillights were off, or one of my headlights wasn't working. I eased off the gas a little, expecting the car to pass me. It didn't. The car stayed directly behind me. A few seconds later, the headlights flashed again. This time, it wasn't a quick flick of high beams. It was more deliberate. On, off, on. I checked my dashboard, making sure all my lights were on. Everything looked normal. I moved into the right lane to give them space to pass. They followed me into the same lane. That was when I started paying closer attention. The distance between our cars stayed the same. Not tailgating, but close enough that I could clearly see the outline of the vehicle behind me. It looked like a black sedan. The headlights flashed again. Short bursts, controlled, almost rhythmic. I sped up slightly, just to see what they would do. They sped up too. At that point, my chest felt tight. Not panic yet, but awareness. That instinctive feeling that something isn't adding up. The highway ahead was empty. No exits for several miles. No other cars nearby. Just darkness stretching out in front of me. I thought about pulling over onto the shoulder. That's what you're supposed to do if another driver is trying to alert you, right? But something about this didn't feel like someone trying to help. That's when it clicked. They weren't using high beams. The headlights weren't flaring brighter like high beams do. They were shutting off completely, then snapping back on. Whoever was behind me was manually turning their headlights on and off. That realization changed everything. I decided I wasn't stopping on the side of the road. I stayed in my lane and focused on the road ahead, counting down the miles until the next exit. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing between the road and my mirrors. The flashing continued the entire time. When I finally saw the sign for a rest stop, I felt a surge of relief. I took the exit immediately. Instead of stopping near the entrance, I drove straight into the parking lot. I chose a spot under a bright overhead light, close to several other parked cars. I pulled in head first so I could leave quickly if I needed to. The car followed me into the lot. It slowed down as it approached my position. For a moment, I thought it was going to park nearby. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, but it didn't stop. It passed directly in front of my car, close enough that I could see the driver's silhouette through the window. They never looked at me. The car kept moving, turned slightly, and then drove back out of the parking lot and onto the highway. I sat there for several minutes without moving. Eventually, I called it in and explained what had happened. A highway patrol officer arrived not long after. He listened quietly while I walked him through everything, from the first flash of headlights to the moment the car left. When I finished, he nodded and told me something I hadn't known. There had been reports of people using flashing headlights to get drivers to pull over. Once the driver stopped, someone would approach the vehicle, pretending there was an issue, something wrong with the lights or the tires. Then they'd force the driver out of the car. He said it calmly, like it was routine information. If I had pulled over on the highway, I would have been completely alone in the dark. I thanked him, got back in my car, and drove the rest of the way home without stopping again. This happened to my uncle while he was driving overnight for work. He's not someone who believes in the paranormal. He doesn't watch horror movies, doesn't talk about ghosts, and isn't the type to exaggerate stories. That's part of why this stuck with me. He didn't tell anyone about it at the time. In fact, he didn't mention it at all until years later, and even then, he told it like he was just stating facts. It was around midnight when it happened. He was driving a familiar rural highway he'd taken dozens of times before. The road cut straight through farmland for miles. No streetlights, no houses, no towns, just open fields on both sides and the occasional fence line disappearing into the dark. The night was quiet, too quiet. No traffic ahead of him and none behind. As he drove, he passed a mile marker on the side of the road, 217. He didn't think much of it. Mile markers blend together when you've been driving for hours. A few minutes later, he noticed another mile marker approaching. When his headlights passed over it, his stomach tightened. 217. At first, he assumed he'd misread it the first time. Fatigue can play tricks on you, especially late at night. He checked his mirrors, half expecting to see a turnoff or curve he might have missed. But the road behind him was straight. The fields were the same. The fences were the same. He kept driving. A few minutes later, he passed the marker again, 217. This time, he felt a surge of unease. He knew he hadn't turned around. He hadn't exited. The road hadn't curved or looped back on itself. It was a straight stretch of highway he knew well. He glanced down at his GPS. It showed him moving forward at a steady speed. Nothing looked wrong. Then the radio crackled. Static filled the car for a few seconds before the station came back. He adjusted the dial, assuming it was just a dead zone. He continued driving. When he passed mile marker 217 for the third time, he knew something wasn't right. The radio cut to static again, louder this time. He slowed slightly, scanning the road ahead. Everything looked normal. The same fields, the same darkness. No intersections, no signs, no buildings. He considered turning around, but there was nowhere to turn. No safe shoulder, no nearby exits. He told himself to stay calm. That's when he saw it for the fourth time. Mile marker 217. But this time, there was someone standing near it. A man. He was standing just off the shoulder of the road, close to the sign. His back was facing traffic. His body angled slightly toward the field, beyond the fence. He wasn't moving. My uncle slowed down instinctively. His first thought was that the man might be broken down, or injured, or waiting for help. But something about the way he stood felt wrong. The man didn't turn when the headlights hit him. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back from the road. As my uncle drove closer, he noticed the man's posture was unnaturally still. His arms hung straight at his sides. His head was slightly bowed, like he was staring at the ground. The radio crackled again, then went completely silent. No static, no station, nothing. As my uncle passed the man, he glanced sideways. That's when he noticed the man's feet. They weren't touching the ground, not by much, maybe a few inches, just enough that there was empty space between the soles of his shoes and the dirt beneath him. My uncle didn't slow down any further. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He kept driving. Within minutes, the road began to change. The fields gave way to buildings. Streetlights appeared. The darkness lifted, replaced by the familiar glow of a small town he recognized immediately. The radio came back on, mid-song, like nothing had happened. Mile markers continued as normal. He finally pulled over at a gas station and checked the time. Nearly 40 minutes had passed. He knew that stretch of road well. It should have taken him less than 10 minutes to reach the town. He sat in his car for a long time before getting out. He didn't tell anyone about it when he got home. He didn't report it. He didn't try to explain it. He just avoided thinking about it. Over the years, he's driven that same highway many times since, always during the day, sometimes at night. He's never seen mile marker 217 again, and he never drives that route overnight anymore. And if you've had a true scary experience, whether it was a creepy stranger, an unsettling coincidence, or something truly paranormal, I want to hear it. Send your story to the email on your screen and check the description box for details. Your experience may be featured in a future video. Let's share the stories that haunt us. See you in the next video.